in the timing of large-scale in-migration of blacks from the South. In San Francisco, for example, that mass influx took place during the Second World War, as blacks from the South were attracted by jobs in new war production facilities, notably the Kaiser shipyards. Henry Kaiser recruited Southern blacks and brought them to the San Francisco Bay Area by the trainloads. The black population of San Francisco, which had been less than 5,000 in 1940, rose to more than 40,000 by the time of the 1950 census, and the black populations of Oakland and Berkeley also rose several-fold during the same decade. In the San Francisco Bay Area, as in the northern cities half a century earlier, there was a long-settled black population which lived free of the Jim Crow laws and practices of the South, and which had been able to get civil service jobs as far back as the 1920s. But although the newcomers were skilled workers more often than the local black residents, culturally, the newcomers lagged far behind. Native-born blacks in the Bay Area described the newcomers as foreign in the way they talked and in their behavior. For example, eating hamburgers openly on the bus, and bologna, and loud talking and fighting on the buses. That never happened in the old days. Some of the new blacks from the South were described as having a little more of a chip on their shoulder than the people out here did. Many local blacks thought that white racism increased after World War II, when both Southern blacks and Southern whites began arriving in large numbers. A similar retrogression in race relations on the Pacific Coast during the Second World War occurred in Portland, Oregon, where again there were large influxes of black workers to take jobs in the growing war industries. These new black arrivals with little education were resented by the small group of law-abiding and self-sustaining Negroes already living in Portland. As in other places and times, a ghetto now developed in Portland, and discriminations in regard to civil rights were instituted. On the national scene, the much later receding of racism and the socioeconomic advancement of blacks in the second half of the 20th century cannot be attributed simply to the passage of time, for the passage of time had produced major retrogressions in race relations before. Nor can these advances be attributed to the civil rights laws that began in the 1960s, for the advancement of blacks antedated any serious civil rights legislation by years, and was in fact more dramatic in the years preceding such legislation. Between 1940 and 1960, the percent of black families with incomes below the official poverty line fell from 87% to 47%. In various skilled trades, the income of blacks relative to whites more than doubled between 1936 and 1959. The principal factor that raised black incomes during that period, both absolutely and relative to white income, was migration, from low-income areas to higher-income areas. However much these migrations set back those blacks who were already living in northern cities, this movement from the South put millions of blacks into places where their children would get better education, while their parents had better job opportunities. With the passing years and generations, more and more of these migrant families ceased to be Black Rednecks, acculturating themselves in new surroundings, as minority groups tend to do in countries around the world. Once again, racial barriers began to erode after World War II, and before the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Perhaps the most dramatic example was the crumbling of racial barriers in professional sports, exemplified by Jackie Robinson's becoming the first black Major League Baseball player in 1947, 17 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A poll that year showed his popularity to be second only to longtime entertainment idol Bing Crosby. The process of ending racial segregation in American military services was also begun during the Truman administration, years before segregation was declared unlawful in civilian life. In 1948, President Harry Truman ran for re-election on a platform that included civil rights for blacks, which some thought would doom his candidacy. But the fact that he won suggests that white public opinion had already begun to change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dealt major blows to racial restrictions, especially in the South, and had dramatic effects on the number of black elected officials. Economically, however, the upward trends in black income and occupations that had begun decades earlier simply continued, but at no accelerated rate. The rise of blacks into professional and other high-level occupations was in fact greater in the years preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than in the years afterward, and was greater in the 1940s than in the 1950s. Behind such developments was the fact that blacks were closing the gap between themselves and whites in years of schooling during this era. In short, major social transformations within the black community were having an impact in their economic condition. It would hardly be surprising if it also had an impact on how whites viewed blacks, as had happened in the 19th century. The civil rights legislation of the 1960s may well have been an effect of the rise of blacks, rather than the sole or predominant cause of that rise, as it has been represented as being by those leaders, black and white, with incentives to magnify their own role in racial progress. The difference between cultural explanations of changing race relations and explanations based on political acts or swings of the pendulum in white public opinion is not just a matter of intellectual preference. There are wholly different implications, not only about the past, but especially about the future. The question is whether the advancement of blacks is helped or hindered by promoting a black identity built around a redneck culture whose track record has been largely negative for both blacks and whites.